July 1944, Hill 192, just east of St. Lo, in the bocage country of Normandy. If you were a German paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division holding that hill, you'd already watched a lot of war. You had fought at Cassino, you had fought in Russia, you knew what artillery sounded like, you knew what it felt like, you knew the rules. And then, in July of 1944, the rules stopped working. There's a detail in the American official histories that is so strange, so statistically bizarre that the first time you read it, you assume it is a misprint. The 2nd Infantry Division, one single American division, fired up to 20 time-on-target missions. A night onto Hill 192. Not 20 shells, not 20 barrages, 20 coordinated concentrations, each one involving multiple battalions of guns, firing for no reason that any German commander could understand, often at positions where no German soldier was standing, often at hedgerows that the Americans had already cleared with artillery the night before, often at roads that nobody was walking on. The American artillery commander of the 29th Infantry Division, General William Sands, recorded in his division's history that on a single day in mid-July, his guns fired 459 missions and over 13,000 rounds in 24 hours. One hill, one day, 13,000 shells. And when American photo reconnaissance flew over Hill 192 afterward, what they saw was so eaten up by craters that one American officer, quoted in the official divisional accounts, said the hill looked like a moth-eaten blanket from the air. To a German artillery officer trained on the Truppenführung, the Wehrmacht's sacred field manual, this was not war. This was insanity. This was a violation of everything artillery was supposed to be. Every shell that left a German gun had been calculated, pre-plotted, rationed, accounted for. Every round had a destination. Every firing was a transaction. And here were the Americans, burning through shells like water, firing at bushes, firing at mud, firing at nothing at all. German commanders watched this across the line from Hill 192 and reached a conclusion that their doctrine demanded. The Americans were incompetent. They were wasteful. They were firing blindly. They were soldiers who had never been taught to count. They were wrong. Here is the sentence that explains the entire Western Front after 1944, and most Germans never understood it. The Americans were not wasting ammunition. The Americans were not missing their targets. The Americans had stopped aiming. To understand how an army could fire 13,000 shells in 24 hours at a hill where most of the rounds would never hit a single enemy soldier, and why this was not madness, but the most carefully designed artillery doctrine of the war, we have to go back to a simple economic fact, a fact that shaped every decision the Wehrmacht ever made about a cannon, a fact that in 1944 the Americans had broken, and when they broke it, they broke something the Germans could not conceive of because their industrial base could never have sustained it. The story of how that happened is not a story about guns. It is a story about what an army can afford to believe. Part 1. The German Calculus. For any German artillery officer who served from 1941 onward, there was a number he could recite in his sleep: 50. That was roughly how many rounds a heavy German artillery unit on the Russian front could expect to have on hand by late 1941, per gun, for sustained combat. 50 rounds. If you were defending a sector and the Russians came in waves, 50 rounds meant you had minutes before your barrels were cold and your crew was holding a piece of machined steel that could do nothing to save them. By 1944, the number had not improved. In many cases, it had gotten worse. The central fact of German artillery in the Second World War, a fact that the Wehrmacht's doctrine, training, and logistics all built around, was scarcity. A German gun crew never had enough shells. A German battery never had enough guns. A German regiment never had enough horses to pull the guns it did have. That last detail matters more than it sounds. In 1944, most German artillery in Normandy was horse-drawn, not in 1918, in 1944. The most technologically advanced army in Europe, the army that had developed the V-2 rocket and the jet fighter and the first assault rifle, was moving its cannons with the same horsepower that had moved Napoleon's cannons to Moscow. The German historian and General Hans Eberbach, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army against the British in Normandy, left a record of what his artillery actually looked like at the moment of one of the most important campaigns of the war. His guns, he wrote, included pieces from every major power in Europe. French guns, captured in 1940. Czech guns, captured in 1939. Russian guns, captured on the Eastern Front. Some of his pieces had been manufactured during the First World War, acquiring the proper ammunition for each type, matching shells to guns, maintaining the firing tables. Eberbach described this as a logistical nightmare, and that is how military historians have described it ever since. So the Wehrmacht's artillery doctrine was not built by men who believed in abundance. It was built by men who treated every shell as the last shell, and their doctrine, codified in the Truppenführung, was explicit. The manual stated that artillery must be used with great mobility to achieve its full effect. Every shot must serve a purpose. Counter-battery fire first to silence the enemy guns, then targets dangerous to the infantry, then harassment of enemy command posts. A methodical, prioritized system designed to make every round count, because every round might be the last. This doctrine produced something remarkable in its own right. German artillery, when it fired with extraordinary precision. Pre-plotted targets, survey-based coordinates, careful bracketing. A German gun crew could put its first ranging shots inside a 50-meter circle at 10 kilometers. The Americans captured German firing tables during the war and studied them with professional admiration. The accuracy was real. But here is what the Germans had traded for that accuracy: speed and flexibility. The German system required pre-plotted survey positions, a new target, a target that appeared suddenly on an unexpected axis, required 10 to 15 minutes of careful calculation before effective fire could begin. 10 minutes is an eternity in combat. 10 minutes is the difference between catching an attacking column in the open and watching it disappear into cover. And then there was counter-battery fire. German batteries, the American official histories note with what the Americans called monotonous regularity, were reluctant to engage in artillery duels. When American counter-battery fire arrived, German guns tended to go silent. This was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. If a German battery expended its precious ammunition in a duel, it would not have what it needed for the real work when the infantry came. Better to hide, better to conserve. Better to wait for the moment when every shell had to matter. All of this produced a German artillery officer who, by 1944, had been drilled for his entire professional career in a single mental discipline: waste nothing, aim everything, justify every round. A German major interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, asked to describe what American artillery looked like from the receiving end, returned again and again in his testimony to a simple observation: the Americans fired without targets, and to him, that was not a sign of strength. That was a sign that their commanders did not know what they were doing. He was reading the Americans through the only lens his doctrine had given him. And his doctrine was missing something. Something that was not a weapon and was not a tactic. Something that was, in the American system, the entire point. Because across the hedgerows from him, on the other side of a few hundred meters of bocage, the Americans were firing 13,000 rounds a day at an empty hill, and they were not doing it because they could not see. They were doing it because they had decided, at the level of doctrine, that a shell that killed nobody could still do something useful. And to understand what that something was, we need to look at what an American gunner was actually being told to do when he pulled the lanyard on a round that had no target at all. Part 2. The American Answer. There's a piece of military terminology that the U.S. Army codified into official doctrine during the Second World War, and that most civilians have never heard of: harassing and interdiction fire, H&I fire. 3 words that describe what a German commander watching American artillery in Normandy would have called inexplicable waste, and what an American colonel sitting behind the lines with a fire direction grid would have called a planned, deliberate, published tactic with a line item in the ammunition budget. Here is the core idea, and it is so simple that it took an industrial nation to believe in it. You do not need to kill the enemy with every round. You need to break him. Pick a road junction 12 kilometers behind the German front. You have no observer on that junction. You cannot see who is using it, but you know, because any reasonable commander would know, that the Germans must move supplies through that junction at night. Food, ammunition, replacements, medical supplies, fuel. Now imagine you drop a shell on that junction at 0223 hours. No target in particular, just a shell. And another at 0307, and another at 0418, and another at 0512. Not a barrage, not a concentration, not an attack. Just one shell at random intervals every few minutes for hours. What happens to the German supply column that was supposed to move through that junction tonight? It does not move, or it moves and loses a truck and then stops, or it diverts to a longer route that takes twice as long, or the driver, who's been awake for 36 hours because a different junction was getting the same treatment, falls asleep at the wheel, or the mess cart never arrives at the forward battalion, and the forward battalion eats nothing tomorrow, and by 1500 hours tomorrow there are men in foxholes who have been without food for 2 days and are shaking from cold and hunger. None of those German soldiers is hit by an American shell, not one. And every single one of them has been degraded by the American artillery as surely as if the shell had landed in his foxhole. The U.S. Army's doctrinal language called this a force multiplier. In plain English, it means you do not have to hit anyone to win. This is what the Germans were watching across from Hill 192. The Americans were not firing at targets. The Americans were firing at the German soldier's sleep, at his stomach, at his nerves, at his confidence that the war operated by rules that his training had taught him to read. And the Wehrmacht had no defense against this, because the Wehrmacht could not have done it if it had wanted to. The Wehrmacht did not have the shells. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent more time with American infantry than any reporter of the war, wrote a dispatch that captures the moment American soldiers began to understand what they had in their artillery. In words that he put to paper in 1943, and that read like a small miracle of understatement, Pyle wrote that American artillery had become sensational. His exact line, which reached millions of American newspaper readers, was that American officers told him they actually had more guns than they knew what to do with. Every gun in a sector could be centered to shoot at one spot. Pyle wrote that veteran German soldiers had said they had never been through anything like it. More guns than we know what to do with. Pause on that sentence. In 1943, mid-war. That is not an army running out of ammunition. That is not an army carefully calculating whether to fire a round. That is the worldview of a nation whose factories were pouring out 155mm shells at the rate of 567,000 a month. At Hill 192, the 2nd Infantry Division's up to 20 time-on-target missions per night were not ornamental. They were doctrine. And the doctrine was, never let the German infantry rest, never let them resupply without cost, never let them forget for more than a few minutes that they are under fire. The American Military Encyclopedia's definition of harassing fire is blunt and honest about what the tactic does. It denies sleep, denies resupply, induces psychological collapse over time, and eventually produces what the manuals call a dissociative reaction from exhaustion and fear. The Germans in those foxholes on Hill 192 were not being shelled because the Americans thought they were there. The Germans were being shelled because they might be there. Because if they were there, they might move. Because if they moved, they might attack. Because if they were not shelled, they might sleep. And a rested German is a dangerous German, and an exhausted German is half a soldier. And here is the detail that turns the whole picture from strange into terrifying. The American Fire Direction Center did not need a forward observer to see each mission. The FDC had coordinates. The FDC had the grid. The FDC had firing tables pre-computed for every conceivable variable. Wind, barrel wear, temperature, humidity. An American battery in Normandy could put steel on a map reference in under 3 minutes from first call. A German battery, working from pre-plotted survey positions, needed 10 to 15 minutes for an impromptu target. The Americans fired faster, fired more, and fired places a German gunner would never have fired because to a German gunner firing into an empty field was professional malpractice. To the German officer on the receiving end of this, the only honest way to describe it was, the Americans have abandoned the profession. They have stopped doing artillery. They are doing something else. They were doing something else. But it wasn't incompetence. It was the single largest military innovation of the entire Western Front, and it depended on one thing that the Germans could not match, could not replicate, and could not even have imagined if they had tried. Men like the paratroopers who held Hill 192, the Fallschirmjäger who died under artillery fire from guns they never saw and shells that had not been aimed at them, deserve to be remembered by the men who fought against them. Every like on this video keeps the story of that hill visible for a few more people. It doesn't cost anything. It matters more than it should. And the something the Germans could not match? It was not a gun. It was not a shell. It was a thing moving across the French countryside in late August of 1944. And the Germans never saw it coming because they couldn't imagine that anybody had built it. Part 3. The River of Steel. On August 25, 1944, a system went into operation on the roads of western France that had no precedent in the history of warfare. It was officially called the Red Ball Express. It consisted of nearly 6,000 trucks, most of them the 2.5-ton GMC cargo trucks that the Americans called the Deuce and a Half. It ran day and night along a dedicated route from Cherbourg toward the advancing American front, and civilian traffic was forbidden on its roads. At its peak, it moved roughly 12,500 tons of supplies per day. In its 83 days of operation, it delivered over 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts to 28 advancing American divisions. 12,500 tons per day, of which a significant portion was artillery ammunition. A single 155mm shell weighs 95 pounds. You can do the math. And 3/4 of the drivers were African American soldiers in a segregated army that for most of its existence refused to put black men in combat roles. The Red Ball Express was driven, loaded, unloaded, and maintained primarily by men who were formally considered unfit for the front line and who, in that role, became the single most important reason the front line could fight. Now compare that river of steel to what the Germans were working with. We have already seen Eberbach's inventory, guns from every power in Europe. But the German supply situation in 1944 was worse than just equipment. The Wehrmacht in the West relied, according to American intelligence assessments and post-war analysis, on horse-drawn transport for a significant portion of its artillery ammunition delivery. Some German infantry formations in the Ardennes in late 1944 reportedly had more horses than they had men. A horse can pull about a ton of cargo. A horse needs to eat. A horse moves at a walking pace. A horse is a beautiful animal and a devastating liability when the other side has 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons a day. Here is the American production picture. In May of 1942 alone, American factories produced 567,000 rounds of 155mm artillery ammunition. 1 month, 1 caliber, nearly 600,000 shells. For comparison, in 2023, with the entire combined manufacturing capacity of the United States dedicated to the problem, the Pentagon was producing 28,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition per month. That is not a typo. A single 1942 month produced more 155mm shells than 2 years of 2023 level American industry. This is what the Germans did not understand. And this is what the Germans could not understand. Because to understand it, you had to accept a premise that Truppenführung did not have room for, that war is not a contest of precision. War is a contest of throughput. The American artillery doctrine, the harassing fire, the interdiction fire, the time on target missions at empty hilltops, the 20 tots per night at Hill 192, the 13,000 rounds in 24 hours, all of it was built on the assumption that ammunition was a river, not a reservoir. A river flowing out of American factories, through American Atlantic convoys, through Cherbourg, through the Red Ball Express, out to American batteries in Normandy and Belgium and Germany. If you were drawing from a river, waste was not a concept. Waste is only a concept in a reservoir economy. A photograph exists in the National Archives. It was taken on the 31st of December, 1944, at the position of Battery C, 28th Field Artillery Battalion of the 8th Infantry Division. 3 American gunners are standing next to a 155 millimeter shell. On the shell, they have inscribed a message in white paint for Adolf, Unhappy New Year. They are grinning. They are about to fire that shell into Germany, and they are writing jokes on it. That shell cost a machinist in Pennsylvania a few hours to make. The 3 men standing next to it know that when they pull the lanyard, the next shell will arrive by truck before the barrel is cool. That is not how a German gun crew on the Russian front in 1941 ever behaved. A German gun crew on the Russian front in 1941 had 50 rounds per gun, and you do not write jokes on the last of 50 rounds. General Omar Bradley wrote, in his autobiography, A General's Life, about the logistics situation in late 1944. Each of his 28 divisions consumed roughly 700 to 750 tons of supplies per day during offensive operations. Total daily consumption, around 20,000 tons. That is the number every American commander in Europe carried in his head. Not how many men, how many tons. And this is where the whole picture finally comes together and reveals itself. When a German officer watched the Americans fire on an empty field, he saw waste because he was doing the mental arithmetic a Truppenführer-trained officer did. What did that shell cost? What did it kill? What is the ratio? When an American battery commander fired on that same empty field, he was doing an entirely different piece of arithmetic. What did that shell deny to the enemy? What did it prevent? What did it ruin for the Germans on the receiving end who now could not move through that field, that road, that night? The American was not asking what the shell did. He was asking what the shell prevented. And prevention scales in a way that targeting never does, because you can fire prevention at 10 places at once, at empty places, at possible places, at places where nobody is yet. And if the shell hits nothing, the field is still ruined for whoever tries to use it next. The German doctrine asked, is it worth firing? The American doctrine asked, can we afford not to fire? And the American answer in 1944 was no, we cannot afford not to fire. We cannot afford to give the Germans a quiet minute. We cannot afford to let them believe that silence means safety. This is why American artillery in 1944 looks from the German records like lunacy and from the American records like the most efficient thing the Army ever did. They were running 2 different calculations in 2 different currencies from 2 different industrial bases, and only one of those industrial bases made the calculation possible at all. The Germans had figured out, by the 2nd year of the Western Campaign, that something was wrong with their reading of the American system. They had figured out that the waste was producing results that had no business occurring, and a general who had commanded some of the most powerful formations in the Wehrmacht had begun to put into writing what it looked like from his end. Part 4. The German realization. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had seen everything an army could do to another army. He had fought the French in 1940. He had built the Africa Corps. He had humiliated the British in the desert. He had survived being called the Desert Fox by enemies who meant it as a compliment. And by the summer of 1944, in Normandy, he was writing field reports in language that, for a man of Rommel's professional caution, amounted to shouting. The words Rommel put into his reports from the Italian campaign and then from Normandy are preserved and have been quoted by military historians for 80 years. In Italy, he wrote about the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery and observed that this superiority had broken the front open. In Normandy, he wrote about the Allies' great superiority in artillery and what he called the outstandingly large supply of ammunition that supported it. Outstandingly large supply of ammunition. A German field marshal, in the middle of the most important defensive battle of his career, writing to his superiors that the fundamental problem was not American tactics, or American courage, or American generalship, but the American ammunition train. He was not the only one. Fritz Bayerlein, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa and then commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, the most lavishly equipped armored division the Wehrmacht ever fielded, experienced American artillery on the 25th of July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the American breakout attempt near St. Lo. The Americans preceded their ground attack with what was at the time the most intensive aerial and artillery bombardment the war had seen. Byerlin described it in words that survived into the historical record in both German and English, and that have been quoted by every serious historian of the Normandy campaign. His account, from his post-war manuscripts, described the bombers coming as if on a conveyor belt. He wrote that back and forth the carpets were laid. He wrote that artillery positions were wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, infantry positions flattened, all roads and tracks destroyed. By midday, he wrote, the entire area resembled a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. All signal communications had been cut and no command was possible. The shock effect on the troops, Byerlin wrote, was indescribable. Several of his men went mad and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by splinters. Byerlin later reported that he had lost at least 70% of his troops, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. His word, numbed. That is what sustained American artillery does to the mind of a veteran soldier who has been trained to read the rules of combat. It does not just kill him. It erases his ability to know when he is safe. And here is where the American advantage compounded with something new. Because while Rommel was writing his reports and Byerlin was watching his division die, the American army had been sitting on a secret weapon that they had not yet been authorized to fire at German ground targets. It was called the proximity fuse, the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, and it was about to arrive in the Ardennes, a conventional artillery shell detonated on impact. If it hit soft ground, it buried itself before exploding, and much of its killing power went up and out. A soldier flat on the ground had a real chance of surviving. The VT fuse changed that. It was a tiny radio transmitter built into the nose of the shell. It detonated the shell automatically at the mathematically optimal height above the ground, turning every round into a perfect airburst. Shrapnel rained straight down on whoever was below. A foxhole was not cover. Being prone was not cover. The only cover was overhead. The American Army Air Force had restricted the VT fuse for use against ground targets until late 1944 because they were terrified that a German-captured example would be reverse-engineered into anti-aircraft ammunition that could devastate Allied bomber formations. On the 16th of December 1944, the day the Battle of the Bulge began, the restriction was lifted. VT-fused shells began flowing to American batteries across the entire front. General George S. Patton sent a letter to the War Department a few days later. The letter is part of the historical record and has been quoted by every serious account of American artillery in the Second World War. In it, Patton described catching a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. He described firing a battalion concentration at them with VT-fused shells. And then he provided a casualty count that, because he knew the War Department would want the numbers, he described as by actual count. His figure was 702 dead, one engagement, 702 German soldiers dead from one concentration. And Patton wrote in that same letter that when all armies got this shell, they would have to devise new methods of warfare. Stack the layers now. American forward observers in Piper Cub L-4, grasshoppers flying at 1,000 feet, doing 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theater from D-Day to VE Day. Any German soldier who saw a grasshopper circling knew, in the words of the documented American liaison aviation history, that a lethal American barrage would break over his head within minutes. German daylight movement became, in that history's phrase, problematic, which is a polite military word for suicidal. Americans could see everything that moved. Americans could fire instantly at anything they saw. Americans could fire harassing missions at everything they could not see. And now, starting December 1944, the Americans' shells exploded above the foxholes instead of in them. For a German commander reading this from the receiving end, there was no tactical answer. You could not take cover because the cover did not work. You could not move by day because the grasshoppers would spot you. You could not move by night because the H&I fire would catch you. You could not counter battery because by the time your crew calculated the firing solution, the American FDC had shifted to a new target. You could not even, in the end, maintain the sanity of your troops. The men, as Bayerling said, went numb. The Germans had been right about one thing in their original assessment. The American artillery was doing something that had never been done before. What they had been wrong about was which direction the something was going. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served in the American Field Artillery, the 2nd Infantry, the 29th Infantry, the 8th Infantry, Patton's 3rd Army, or any of the units who put steel on German positions in 1944, I will be grateful to hear their name and unit in the comments. The men who fired these guns are mostly gone. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. March 23, 1945. The Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland. No foreign army had crossed the Rhine by force in 140 years, not since Napoleon. The Germans had built their defensive plans around the river. They treated it as a line that the Americans, for all their firepower, could not cross without paying an impossible price. On the evening of March 23rd, the American Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, in coordination with Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, opened fire on the German positions on the eastern bank. According to published accounts of the 945th Field Artillery Battalion and related histories, approximately 2,070 American guns fired, joined by British and Canadian artillery to bring the total to around 4,000 pieces. The flash of their muzzles, historians noted, was visible for the length of the flat western bank of the river. These same accounts describe roughly 1,000 rounds per minute and over 65,000 rounds total fired in the opening bombardment. The assault battalions of the 30th Infantry Division went into the water expecting the worst river crossing of the war. They found almost nothing. The German defenders on the eastern bank had been so comprehensively suppressed that the first American units landed with negligible resistance. Within 4 days, the Ninth Army had established a bridgehead 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The Rhine, the wall of German strategy, was gone. Not because American infantry had fought harder than German infantry, not because American tanks had outperformed German tanks, because the Americans had put 65,000 artillery rounds onto the east bank of the river before the first man stepped into a boat. The German army that surrendered in May of 1945 did not surrender because it had run out of men. It surrendered because it had figured out, unit by unit, in the silence between American artillery concentrations, that the war was a kind of arithmetic that Germany could not compete in. You cannot fight a war in which every road junction is shelled at 0223. You cannot fight a war in which every hilltop gets 20 time-on-target concentrations per night. You cannot fight a war in which the enemy's forward observer is 1,000 feet overhead at all times, and the enemy's shells explode above your foxhole instead of in the ground, and the enemy's logistics system is a river of trucks that never stops moving. The American official histories record, with what one contemporary officer called monotonous regularity, that German prisoners of war remarked on the heavy volume of American fire. They remarked on its accuracy. They remarked on its speed. They remarked on its ability to arrive without warning. And they remarked, in the formulation that recurred in interrogation after interrogation, on the apparent indifference of American commanders to the ammunition they were expending. The Germans did not understand it, in the end, any better than they had understood it in Normandy. They just knew that they were on the losing side of it. And this is the verdict the forensic audit produces when you line up all the evidence. The Germans were not wrong when they looked at American artillery and saw what appeared to be waste. They were right that the Americans were firing thousands of rounds at positions where nobody was standing. They were right that no German manual would have approved of it. They were right that it violated every principle of artillery discipline that a German officer had ever been taught. What they were wrong about was what that fire was doing. The Germans were grading the Americans on the metric that their own doctrine used, which was shells to casualties. By that metric, the Americans were terrible. They were the worst artillerymen in the war. They were burning 10 shells for every German they killed, sometimes 100, sometimes 1,000 at a hilltop where nobody was. By the German metric, the American artillery arm was a catastrophe of professional malpractice, But the American metric was not shells to casualties. The American metric was what those shells prevented the German from doing, prevented them from moving by day, prevented them from sleeping at night, prevented them from resupplying in time, prevented their counterattacks from forming up in their assembly areas, because the assembly areas got 3 American division worth of artillery dropped on them before the attacking units were even organized, prevented the German war from being a contest on equal terms, because there were no equal terms when one side's shells flowed like water and the other side's shells were counted in rations of 50. And here is the philosophical core of it, the part that Truppenführung had no concept for, and that took the Germans, in the end, the entire war to begin to understand. The American system was not about individual shells. It was about the aggregate denial of enemy possibility. A shell that killed nobody had still done work, because that shell had been in the air over a German road junction, and the fact of that shell in the air meant the German column did not go that way tonight. Multiply that shell by tens of thousands. Multiply those junctions by hundreds. Multiply those nights by months. The Germans were not being defeated by American individual rounds. They were being defeated by the American aggregate, the thing that emerges when a whole industrial nation has decided that ammunition is a renewable resource. A German gun crew counting its 50 rounds could not have done this if it had wanted to. It did not have the shells. It did not have the trucks. It did not have the factories. It did not have the Piper Cubs. It did not have the fire direction centers linked by radio to every battery in range. It did not have the proximity fuse. It did not have Cherbourg. And because it did not have these things, its doctrine had to be built around a premise of scarcity, and its officers had to look at American abundance and call it incompetence, because their minds had no other category to put it in. The Americans were not wasteful. The Americans were not careless. The Americans had done something harder than either of those things. They had, at the level of doctrine, understood what industrial war actually was, and then they had built an army that could fight it. Erwin Rommel figured this out at the end of his life and wrote it down, and was heard only by the historians who came after. Fritz Bayerlin watched his division become a moonscape and put it in his post-war manuscripts. The unnamed German major, who sat across the interrogation table from an American officer after the Bulge and described American fire as targetless, saw, correctly, that the Americans were not aiming. He just did not understand that they had decided, above the level of any individual battery, that aiming was no longer the point. The point was presence. The point was denial. The point was to fill the air between the German soldier and the German soldier's ability to sleep, eat, move, resupply, or rest with an infinite series of small steel hammers, each of which had a measurable cost in an American factory that, in the spring of 1942, had produced 567,000 rounds of one caliber in 1 month. War is a contest of what you can afford to spend. The Germans could afford precision. The Americans could afford prevention. And in a war that lasted from 1941 to 1945, prevention compounded. It compounded in the form of a German division that did not counterattack because its fuel dump had been shelled at 0300. It compounded in the form of a panzer regiment that arrived at its assembly area missing half of its vehicles, because those vehicles had been abandoned on a road that a Piper Cub had spotted. It compounded in the form of Fritz Bayerlin writing that his men had gone mad and run in the open. You cannot buy madness in German soldiers with precision. You can only buy it with volume. And the volume is what the Germans, from their first contact with American artillery in North Africa in 1943 to their last surrender in May of 1945, never had the doctrine to understand, because their doctrine had been built by an army that did not have enough shells to waste. Our doctrine, the American doctrine, had been built by an army that had decided correctly that the word waste did not apply. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the viewers who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More doctrines, more generals, more men like the gunners of Battery C of the 28th Field Artillery Battalion who signed their shells, and the African American drivers of the Red Ball Express who made all of it possible. Remember this about the men who fired those guns. They were not trying to waste shells. They were trying to bring their friends home. The system they built did that because it understood something the Germans could not afford to understand. They deserve to be remembered by name and by unit and by the work they did with the industrial river of steel their country put into their hands.